Open book Miss Marple and the Midnight Letter in violet ink. Chapter 1. Violet Ink at Midnight. The village of Marleycombe was a place that seemed to slumber even when it was awake. Nestled among rolling green fields and framed by ancient oak trees, it was the kind of village where the loudest disturbance most days came from the postmistress dropping her bundle of newspapers, or the blacksmith's hammer striking in the forge. People lived quietly, houses wore ivy-like shawls, and gossip moved with the leisurely rhythm of afternoon tea. Yet even the most peaceful places can harbor shadows, and on one particular night in late September, the shadows lengthened in Marleycombe. The clock in the tower of St. Mildred's Church had just struck midnight when a figure, cloaked in dark overcoat and scarf, slipped through the village square. The square was deserted save for a faint glow in the window of the vicarage study, where Reverend Hargreaves often stayed up late preparing sermons. He did not see the stranger, nor did Mrs. Larkin, the innkeeper's wife, though she stirred uneasily in her sleep as if sensing some disturbance in the air. The figure paused under the vicarage wall, glancing about as though fearful of being seen. Then, from the pocket of the overcoat, a folded envelope was drawn out. It was a thick envelope, heavy with the weight of something more than just paper, and the name on the front had been written in a hand that was elegant yet firm. The ink gleamed faintly even in the thin wash of moonlight. Violet ink. With quick, almost furtive movement, the letter was slid under the vicarage door. The figure lingered only a moment, as if considering whether to knock or flee. Then, soundlessly, the figure turned back into the night, melting into the mist that hung over Marleycombe. When morning came, the village awoke to birdsong and the smell of bread from Mrs. Partridge's bakery. The vicar, Reverend Hargreaves, found the envelope on his doormat as he went to collect the morning milk. His brows furrowed. Letters delivered at midnight were not a common occurrence in Marleycombe. Inside, the letter was written on heavy cream paper. The violet ink danced across the page in graceful loops. The words themselves, however, were far less graceful. Secrets cannot remain buried forever. The truth will come to light. One among you is guilty, and justice waits in the dark. Midnight speaks more than morning ever can. There was no signature. The Reverend read the letter twice, his expression shifting from puzzlement to alarm. He tucked it hastily into his pocket, not quite knowing whether to show it to his wife, who was already busy arranging flowers for the altar, or to keep it to himself. He chose, in the end, to confide in only one person that morning: Miss Jane Marple. Miss Marple was sitting in her neat garden, knitting needles flashing steadily in her small, capable hands. The roses had begun to fade with the turn of the season, but her borders were still tidy, every weed pinched out almost as soon as it dared to appear. She looked up from her work with the mildest of smiles as the vicar approached, letter clutched in his hand. "My dear Miss Marple," he began, lowering his voice although they were alone, "I have received something most extraordinary, and I hardly know what to make of it." Miss Marple's blue eyes, sharp beneath her soft white hair, studied his face a moment before she took the envelope. She did not rush. Instead, she set her knitting gently on her lap and unfolded the paper with fingers that trembled not at all. She read it once. Then again. Her expression did not change, though a faint crease appeared between her brows. "Well," she said softly, "this is not the sort of correspondence one usually receives with the morning milk." The Reverend gave a nervous laugh. "I thought perhaps it was some foolish prank, some schoolboy mischief." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, this is not the hand of a boy. It is a cultivated hand. Female, I should think, though one can never be entirely certain. And violet ink. Well, that is rather a choice, isn't it? Not common, certainly. It suggests someone who wishes to be noticed, though not openly." The vicar shifted uneasily. "But what can it mean? One among you is guilty." "It sounds like a threat." "Or a warning," Miss Marple murmured, folding the letter carefully and sliding it back into the envelope. "You mustn't be too quick to assume, Reverend. Warnings may be genuine, or they may be intended to mislead. Still, it is curious. Quite curious indeed." The vicar wrung his hands. "Should I take it to the police, do you think?" Miss Marple gave him a thoughtful glance. "Perhaps not yet. Inspector Craddock is a good man, but policemen see wickedness in rather broad strokes. A letter like this, it may be better first to see how the village responds. You may be sure, once it is whispered about, that it will stir up more than a few tongues. And indeed it did. By the time Miss Marple had finished her modest luncheon of cold ham and bread, the news of the mysterious violet letter had already spread to the high street. Mrs. Banbury, the butcher's wife, repeated the words with dramatic flair to anyone who would listen. Mr. Trelawney at the post office claimed it was surely aimed at Lady Hartwell, who was known to be rather too free with her champagne and opinions. Young Elsie, the maid at the inn, whispered that she'd heard it was about smuggling, though what smuggling could possibly be done in sleepy Marleycombe was left vague. Miss Marple, meanwhile, listened. She listened at the grocer's, she listened at the tea shop, she listened as she passed two gardeners conversing over a hedge. She asked no questions of her own. It was her way to let the talk run like water, and quietly notice where it flowed too freely or too carefully. That evening, as the sun went down over the village and painted the fields in long shadows, Miss Marple sat once more with her knitting. The click of her needles was steady, soothing. But her mind was not idle. A letter written in violet ink. Delivered at midnight. No name signed, but words chosen with the precision of a needle's point. There was intent behind it. Malice, perhaps, or fear. And if there was one thing Jane Marple had learned in her long life, it was this: where there is a whisper of guilt, there is usually a story that ends in tears, or worse. She did not yet know whose story it would be, but she felt, in her bones, that the peace of Marleycombe was about to be disturbed in a way that no one in the village would forget. Chapter 2: Gossip in the Tea Shop. The Marleycombe tea rooms were, in their way, the very heart of village life. Situated just off the square, with lace-curtained windows and a faint, ever-present scent of lavender polish, they offered pots of strong tea, currant buns that were sometimes a little dry, and a space in which news was exchanged with more efficiency than any printed newspaper. By the following afternoon, the mysterious violet letter had become the only subject worth discussing. Mrs. Banbury, the butcher's wife, occupied her customary seat near the counter. She leaned forward with the relish of a woman who has just discovered a particularly juicy cut of meat and is not about to let it slip away. Opposite her sat Mrs. Larkin, the innkeeper's wife, whose round cheeks flushed pink with the excitement of repeating half-heard tales. "I tell you, Clara," Mrs. Banbury said, lowering her voice only slightly, "the letter was slid under the vicarage door in the dead of night. The Reverend himself found it. And quite shaken he was, too, when I saw him this morning, though he tried to hide it behind polite smiles." Mrs. Larkin gasped as though she had not already heard the same details from at least two other sources. "But what did it say, then?" Mrs. Banbury glanced around, savoring her authority. "Why, it accused someone of being guilty, didn't it? Guilty of, well, something dreadful. That's the clever part. It didn't say what. It left it hanging. Just imagine. Anyone could be guilty of anything for all we know." A murmur of interest passed among the other patrons, who were doing a poor job of pretending they weren't listening. At a corner table near the window, Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, eyes lowered, the picture of mild detachment. She was, of course, listening to every word. She always did. "Well," Mrs. Larkin said, lowering her voice, "if you ask me, it's Lady Hartwell who ought to be worried. Everyone knows she's not half so respectable as she pretends. Remember the summer fete 2 years ago? That scandal with the gardener." Now, Mrs. Banbury interrupted with relish. "We mustn't jump to conclusions. For my part, I'd say it points more towards that clerk of Mr. Pritchard's. Always skulking about with a face like a thundercloud. And I heard tell he's in debt up to his ears. A guilty conscience if ever I saw one." Mrs. Larkin pursed her lips, disappointed not to have the last word. "Still, there's many in Marleycombe who wouldn't want their secrets dragged into daylight. And some secrets are darker than others." A hush fell at those words. It was the sort of hush that suggested each listener was, for one guilty moment, wondering if the letter might concern them. Miss Marple sipped her tea and set down her cup with delicate precision. She looked out the window, her gaze apparently fixed on the passing dray cart loaded with barrels for the inn. But her ears were open, and her mind moved with quiet precision. It was always telling, she thought, to observe not merely who spread gossip but how. Some enjoyed the drama, others deflected attention with too much eagerness, and a few grew a shade too quiet, as though fearing that their name might be mentioned next. Just then, the tea-shop door opened with a jangle of its little brass bell. In swept Mrs. Pritchard, widow of the late solicitor. She was a tall woman, sharp-featured, with eyes that seemed to judge before they glanced away. Her black gloves had been worn long past the period of mourning, and she carried herself with an air of chilly authority. The room's chatter dropped half a pitch as she entered, for Mrs. Pritchard was not one to be trifled with. She ordered her tea with clipped tones and sat at a solitary table, removing her gloves finger by finger as though the task itself required exactness. Mrs. Banbury leaned closer to Mrs. Larkin. "If you ask me," she whispered, though loudly enough that others might overhear, "there's one who has reason to worry. What was Mr. Pritchard if not a man who knew far too much about other people's business? Solicitors always do. And I dare say he had a secret or two himself." Miss Marple's knitting needles, she had drawn them from her bag and set them clicking softly, did not falter. She had often observed that those who whispered loudest about others frequently hoped to draw attention away from their own missteps. Still, the remark about Mr. Pritchard was not without interest. A solicitor, after all, was privy to the kind of information most men would prefer kept locked away. The bell tinkled again, and this time it was Inspector Craddock who entered, his large frame filling the doorway. He had come, perhaps, for a simple pot of tea, but he found himself greeted by an expectant silence. The entire tea-room seemed to lean toward him as though he might, by sheer presence, explain the mystery of the violet letter. Craddock gave a small grunt, hung his hat on the stand, and seated himself heavily at a corner table. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, spotting her with a nod. "Good afternoon, Inspector." Her tone was polite, her smile mild. He accepted his tea from the nervous waitress and looked about him with irritation. "If half the gossip I've heard today were true," he muttered, "Marleycombe would be a den of thieves and villains fit to rival Whitechapel. Best everyone mind their own affairs, instead of making mischief out of shadows." A ripple of disapproval passed through the room, for villagers did not care to be told that their gossip was anything less than a public service. Miss Marple, however, said gently, "You mustn't be too hard on them, Inspector. Gossip is a way of sorting the wheat from the chaff. One only needs to listen carefully to know which is which." Craddock gave her a look that hovered between exasperation and amusement. "You'd have half my constables replaced with old women at their knitting, if you had your way, Miss Marple." She inclined her head. "Not half, Inspector. A third, perhaps." The corners of his mouth twitched, though he disguised it quickly behind his teacup. Meanwhile, Mrs. Larkin and Mrs. Banbury had already resumed their whispering, now speculating on who could possibly have purchased violet ink, for it was hardly common in Marleycombe. "Mrs. Jenkins keeps bottles of it at the stationer's," Mrs. Banbury said knowingly. "Imported from London. Only a few, mind you. And I happen to know that Lady Hartwell bought some not 3 months ago." This tidbit caused a fresh stir. Heads turned, eyes darted, and a murmur went around the tea-shop like a gust of wind shaking the branches of a tree. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly back into her bag. "Well," she said quietly to Inspector Craddock, "I fancy the violet ink will prove more important than most here suspect, but not, perhaps, in the way they imagine." Craddock gave a sigh, already weary of the village's ferment. "Let's hope you're wrong, Miss Marple," he said. But she was rarely wrong. And as she stepped out of the tea-shop into the mellow autumn sunlight, Jane Marple felt the unmistakable tremor of change in the village air. The letter in violet ink had not only unsettled Marleycombe, it had lit a fuse. And in her long experience, a fuse once lit seldom burned without reaching something explosive at the end. Chapter 3: A Shocking Discovery. The morning of the discovery began in the most ordinary way imaginable, which was, Miss Marple often thought, the way disasters most often crept into life. The sun rose pale but bright over Marleycombe, lighting the mist in the meadows with a golden glow. A milk cart rattled down the lane, dogs barked in greeting, and at the vicarage Mrs. Hargreaves was already setting out jars of homemade jam for the church bazaar. To any casual observer, it was simply another peaceful day in a quiet English village. But by 9:30, peace had given way to alarm. It was young Peter Collins, Mr. Pritchard's junior clerk, who raised the cry. He had arrived at the solicitor's office, a neat red brick building on the high street, expecting to find his employer already at his desk. Mr. Pritchard was a punctual man, never later than 8:45, and Peter, though inclined to daydreaming, was habitually early out of nervous respect. This morning, however, the door was locked. Peter tried again, then circled round to the back entrance, which stood slightly ajar. Inside, the office was oddly silent. The faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed magnified, echoing in the stillness. Peter called out once, twice. Receiving no reply, he pushed open the door to the study. The sight within froze him to the spot. Mr. Pritchard sat slumped in his leather chair behind the wide oak desk. His head lolled unnaturally to one side, and his spectacles had slipped down his nose. A teacup lay shattered at his feet, its contents staining the carpet a darker brown. His skin bore that peculiar waxen pallor which left no doubt that life had departed. On the desk, conspicuously placed, lay an envelope. Its address was written in violet ink. Peter gave a strangled cry and stumbled backwards, knocking over a chair as he fled into the street. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, buzzing like bees stirred from a hive. Mrs. Larkin, the innkeeper's wife, wrung her hands and declared it must have been his heart, while Mr. Banbury, the butcher, insisted, with far too much relish, that it was surely poison. The police were summoned, and Inspector Craddock arrived with his usual air of solid, reliable irritation. He pushed his way through the throng, ordered everyone firmly back, and entered the study with measured steps. Miss Marple, who had been passing by on her way to the greengrocer's, found herself drawn inevitably toward the commotion. She did not force her way inside. She was far too discreet for that, but she lingered just long enough at the threshold to glimpse what others might not notice. Mr. Pritchard's desk bore a scattering of papers, most of them in tidy order. The envelope on top was addressed not to him, but to the guilty one. The handwriting, even from her distance, was unmistakably the same violet ink as the letter delivered to the vicarage. Miss Marple's gaze lingered only a moment, but it was enough. She withdrew quietly before Inspector Craddock could spot her and shoo her away with well-meaning firmness. Instead, she waited outside with the other villagers, listening to their chatter. "Poison, I tell you," Mr. Banbury said again, swelling with authority. "You can see it in the color of his lips." "Nonsense," replied Mrs. Banbury tartly. "It's his heart. He was overworked, poor man, and no wonder with a clerk as scatterbrained as Peter. I dare say the boy gave him half his troubles." Mrs. Larkin clutched at her shawl. "But what of the letter? Who would write such a thing? Unless he wrote it himself." At that, several villagers gasped, and speculation grew even wilder. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily distracted. Self-addressed letters were not unheard of in crimes designed to mislead, but she did not think Mr. Pritchard a man of such dramatic temperament. He was, she reflected, a methodical man, careful with his accounts, cautious in his dealings. A man who disliked disorder. To find him surrounded by it now was telling. When at last Inspector Craddock emerged, his face grave, the murmuring crowd fell silent. "Mr. Pritchard is dead," he announced bluntly. "We will need statements from those who were nearby this morning. Cause of death is not yet certain, but there are indications." His gaze swept across the villagers, landing briefly on Miss Marple with a mixture of exasperation and respect. He knew she would already be thinking ahead of him, and he did not like being outrun in his own business. Later that afternoon, the inspector paid a visit to the vicarage, where Miss Marple happened to be having tea with Mrs. Hargreaves. She listened politely as he explained that a sample from Mr. Pritchard's teacup suggested poison. Arsenic, to be precise. "Arsenic," Miss Marple repeated softly, her hands folded in her lap. "So easy to obtain even now. Rat poison, you know, and a favorite in certain cases." The inspector frowned. "I don't much like the look of young Collins. He was the one to find the body, and he's been in debt. Motive enough, if you ask me. Perhaps Pritchard discovered some irregularity in his accounts." Miss Marple nodded with apparent agreement, though her eyes drifted to the lace curtains stirring faintly in the breeze. Yes, that would seem the obvious explanation. Obvious enough that it's likely true, Craddock said with finality. Miss Marple said nothing. She had lived long enough to know that the obvious explanation was often the least reliable. That evening, as the church bell tolled 6, the village square was alive with whispers. Some spoke of Pritchard's clients, who might have wanted secrets kept buried. Others hinted at a quarrel between him and Lady Hartwell over a disputed deed. And a few, lowering their voices to hushed tones, wondered if the violet letter itself was not the true key to the crime. In her sitting room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, though her thoughts were far from idle. She recalled the letter at the vicarage, the gossip in the tea shop, and now this second letter, left like a calling card at the scene of death. Letters at midnight. Violet ink. Poison in a teacup. She paused, her needles motionless in her hands. Somewhere she felt lay a pattern. Small details, insignificant on their own, would in time reveal themselves to be part of a greater whole. And Jane Marple, with her deep knowledge of human folly, intended to discover exactly what that pattern was. For if there was one thing she knew beyond doubt, it was this: Marleycombe had ceased to be a quiet village. With Mr. Pritchard dead and the violet letters loose among them, the peace of the parish had been broken, and would not soon return. Chapter 4. The Inspector's Theory. Inspector Craddock sat in the solicitor's study, his large frame awkwardly crammed into Mr. Pritchard's rather narrow chair. Before him lay the desk, its polished oak now cluttered with evidence bags, photographs, and the accursed letter in violet ink. The shattered teacup had been removed, the carpet carefully cut away to preserve the stained fibers. It was not the inspector's preferred way of working. He disliked turning a respectable man's study into a scene of cold analysis, but murder left no room for sentiment. He tapped his pencil against his notebook and looked up at young Peter Collins, who sat pale and trembling on the opposite side of the desk. "You're certain," Craddock said slowly, "that Mr. Pritchard was alive when you left yesterday evening?" "Yes, sir," Peter stammered. "It was nearly 6 o'clock. He told me to lock the outer door carefully, as he was staying late to finish some papers. I did as he said. When I returned this morning, he was like that." Craddock studied the youth. Nervous, yes, but nerves did not equal guilt. And yet, the boy had debts. More than once, shopkeepers had complained of him being behind with payments. "You've been struggling with money, haven't you?" Peter flushed. "Only a little, sir. I may have borrowed now and again. But I'd never harm Mr. Pritchard. He was strict, but he was fair." The inspector made note, concealing his skepticism. Motive was a slippery thing, and in his experience, young men with debts sometimes did desperate, stupid acts. A knock came at the door, and Sergeant Willis entered. "Sir, we've had word from Dr. Jameson. The poison was indeed arsenic. Likely slipped into the tea." Craddock grunted. "Very well. That narrows it." He turned back to Peter. "Did you prepare your employer's tea this morning?" "No, sir. I never touched it." Craddock leaned back, rubbing his chin. "Then who did?" Peter hesitated. Sometimes Mrs. Pritchard would bring him a tray in the evenings, if he worked late. But I don't know about last night. That, Craddock thought grimly, was another avenue to pursue. By mid-afternoon, Inspector Craddock called at the vicarage. He found Reverend Hargreaves wringing his hands and Miss Marple serenely knitting in the garden. "Ah, Inspector," the vicar said anxiously. "This dreadful business, what will become of us? Poison in Marleycombe. I can scarcely believe it." "It's best to believe it, Reverend," Craddock replied gruffly. "We're dealing with a deliberate act of murder, and I intend to find out who did it." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with that mild, unhurried expression that so often masked the quick dart of her mind. "And you have a theory, no doubt?" Craddock sighed. "I do. Collins, the clerk. He had access, he knew his master's habits, and he had debts hanging round his neck. Seems clear enough." The vicar looked shocked. "But the poor boy, surely not." "Poor or not, he's our likeliest suspect," Craddock said. "I've seen it before. A clerk embezzles, fears discovery, and decides to silence his employer. One pinch of arsenic, and the problem's solved. Or so they think." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Yes, that is one possibility. Craddock shot her a look. You don't sound convinced, Miss Marple. She smiled faintly. Oh, I dare say it could be true. But, you know, in my experience, people rarely choose arsenic for a hasty crime. It is, well, rather an old-fashioned poison, isn't it? One associates it with wills, inheritances, lingering illnesses. Not with a rash young man in debt. Craddock frowned. You think he'd have used something else? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that arsenic suggests planning, a certain cold patience. And patience is not, perhaps, the strongest quality of youth. The inspector rubbed his temple. He had learned, reluctantly, that Jane Marple's instincts were not to be dismissed out of hand. Still, he disliked theories that could not yet be supported with facts. Well, he said gruffly, until I have better evidence, Collins remains my chief suspect. I'll be questioning Mrs. Pritchard next. Miss Marple gave a mild nod, but when the inspector left, she murmured to herself, Yes, Mrs. Pritchard will be interesting indeed. That evening, in the drawing-room of Hartwell Manor, Lady Hartwell poured herself a generous glass of sherry and held court to an eager audience of two. Her companion, Miss Edith Lawson, and her gardener, summoned in to fix the fire. Mark my words, Lady Hartwell declared. This will all come back to that dreadful boy Collins. I always said he had shifty eyes. And now poison. Imagine poison in our own village. Miss Lawson murmured agreement, though her eyes darted nervously toward the window, as if the word itself might summon calamity. Outside, on the path, Miss Marple passed quietly by, her ears catching fragments of the conversation. She walked on without pause, but she tucked the remark away with dozens of others. For she had begun to see a curious pattern emerging, not in the facts of the case, which remained clouded, but in the behavior of the villagers themselves. Fear revealed itself in many guises. Gossip, suspicion, overeager certainty. Some hid it better than others. And in her long experience, those who were most eager to accuse were sometimes the ones with most to conceal. Inspector Craddock returned to his lodgings late that night, tired but unsatisfied. His notebook was full, yet the case remained slippery. He had motive enough for Collins, but the violet letters gnawed at him. They did not fit. If Collins had poisoned his employer, what purpose did those melodramatic notes serve? He closed his notebook with a sigh. He disliked puzzles that smacked of theater. Give him a straightforward case any day. And yet, somewhere in Marleycombe, someone was writing in violet ink, and smiling perhaps at the confusion it spread. Meanwhile, in her cottage, Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and poured herself a small glass of milk before bed. Her thoughts lingered on arsenic, on letters at midnight, on the peculiar tremor she had noticed in Mrs. Pritchard's gloved hand when she entered the tea-shop that afternoon. Oh yes, she murmured softly into the stillness. There is much more beneath the surface. And as the clock struck 11, the village of Marleycombe lay under its blanket of night once more, quiet, respectable, and utterly unaware of the further disturbances yet to come. Chapter 5 whispers at the garden fete. The annual Marleycombe garden fete ought, by tradition, to be a cheerful occasion. Stalls with homemade jam, raffles for embroidered cushions, children darting about with sticky buns, and the inevitable fortune-teller seated in a tent that smelled faintly of mothballs. Yet this year, beneath the bunting and the tinkling of the brass band, there hung a cloud heavier than the August heat, murder. Miss Marple, moving quietly among the stalls with her neat straw hat tied firmly under her chin, observed the subtle differences. The laughter was too brittle, the chatter too hurried, and every group of villagers seemed to circle back to one topic, Mr. Pritchard's sudden death. At the cake stall, Mrs. Price whispered darkly as she handed over a slice of seed cake. Terrible thing, arsenic, isn't it? Not the sort of stuff one has lying about unless one has hens. And the Pritchards never kept hens. Her friend leaned closer. Oh, but I heard he'd ordered some from the chemist. For the roses, they said. Miss Marple's eyes flicked up, her hands busy with her purse. Roses, indeed. The late Mr. Pritchard had been proud of his garden, though whether he himself had ever applied arsenic to it was another matter. She tucked the remark carefully away. The fete committee had insisted on proceeding, to keep up morale. But the vicar looked harassed as he tried to sell tickets for the tombola, and Lady Hartwell complained loudly that the brass band was a semitone flat. Miss Edith Lawson, her ever-nervous companion, hovered in her shadow like a pale ghost. Inspector Craddock arrived in the afternoon, his presence a reminder that Scotland Yard's eye was firmly upon the village. He tried to appear jovial, even bought a toffee apple from a rosy-cheeked girl, but the uniformed constable at his side rather spoiled the effect. He soon found himself approached by Mrs. Pritchard, dressed in morning black, though her veil was a little too stylish for true grief. "Inspector," she said smoothly, "I trust you are making progress? It is such a comfort to know that you and your men are working diligently." Craddock inclined his head. "We are pursuing several lines of inquiry, madam." She lowered her voice. "I hope you are not being misled by idle gossip. This village thrives on it, you know. Why, I have already heard whispers about myself. Imagine. As though I would ever—" She gave a brittle little laugh. Craddock watched her closely. "And yet, madam, it was you who often brought your husband his evening tea, was it not?" For a fraction of a second, Mrs. Pritchard's smile faltered. Then she said brightly, "Oh yes, quite often. But never last evening, Inspector. No, I was with Lady Hartwell, planning the charity raffle. She will tell you so herself." "Indeed she already has," Craddock said evenly. Her painted lips tightened, and she drifted away, leaving the inspector thoughtful. Meanwhile, Miss Marple settled herself near the fortune-teller's tent, ostensibly to rest her feet. In truth, she had chosen her seat with care, for it was here that people tended to pause and gossip while waiting their turn. Two young women, giggling behind gloved hands, whispered of Peter Collins. "They say he was behind in his rent," one said, "and Mrs. Green saw him slip out of the office very late indeed." "Rubbish," said the other. "Everyone knows it was Mrs. Pritchard who wanted him gone. And with her husband out of the way, well, she may find herself a very rich widow indeed." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked serenely, though her ears missed nothing. A little later, she overheard Reverend Hargreaves muttering to the schoolmaster, "Most improper letters, sent at all hours. Violet ink, can you imagine? Positively theatrical." The schoolmaster shook his head gravely. "And what was their purpose, do you suppose? A warning? A boast?" Miss Marple's gaze dropped to her knitting. In her mind's eye she pictured the neat loops of violet script. Not a boast, she thought, nor merely a warning. Letters like those had a purpose, and purposes were rarely simple. As afternoon slipped into evening, the fate wound down. The raffle was drawn, a tin of biscuits won by Mrs. Price, and the last of the lemonade was drunk. Yet the air of unease had not lifted. Inspector Craddock found Miss Marple sitting alone, her basket neatly beside her. He hesitated, then sat down heavily on the bench. "Well, Miss Marple, you've had a chance to observe the villagers in their natural state. What do you make of them?" She looked at him kindly. "People reveal a great deal when they think they are merely amusing themselves, Inspector. Did you notice how Mrs. Pritchard was at pains to remind everyone of her alibi? Or how Lady Hartwell speaks quite as though she enjoys the drama?" Craddock gave a grunt. "Lady Hartwell enjoys drama whether there's murder or not." Miss Marple smiled. "True. But sometimes, Inspector, those who make the most noise are trying to distract from something quieter. Do remember that." He eyed her warily. "You don't seriously think Lady Hartwell has anything to do with it?" "I think," Miss Marple said, folding her knitting neatly into her bag, "that human nature is very much the same everywhere. In St. Mary Mead we once had a case. Oh, quite different in detail, but strikingly similar in its small hypocrisies. And you see, those small hypocrisies often point the way to larger truths." Craddock sighed. "You always make it sound so simple. And yet here I am drowning in gossip and half-truths." Miss Marple rose, steady on her feet despite her age. "Gossip, Inspector, is rarely idle. It is like smoke. One must only discover where the fire lies." And with that she moved off, leaving him staring after her with mingled irritation and respect. That night, Marleycombe seemed restless. Curtains twitched as people checked the lanes, dogs barked at shadows, and more than one villager lay awake pondering arsenic and violet ink. At her cottage window, Miss Marple gazed out at the quiet street. Somewhere among these tidy houses lay the truth. The fate had given her a little more to go on, a glimpse of fear in Mrs. Pritchard's eyes, a tremor in Miss Lawson's hands, a curious eagerness in Lady Hartwell's voice. The puzzle was far from solved, but the picture was slowly taking shape. And Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, meant to see it complete. Chapter 6. The Chemist's Secret. The following morning dawned pale and damp, the kind of grey English morning when the mist hangs low and the hedgerows drip with dew. Miss Marple, who always rose early, was already in her small but orderly sitting room, writing a note to her nephew Raymond about the local festivities, when there came a discreet knock on the door. It was Inspector Craddock. His boots were muddy, his brow furrowed. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "I'd be obliged if you'd accompany me to the chemist's shop. There's been some talk that I'd like your interpretation of." Miss Marple set aside her note at once. "Of course, Inspector. The chemist is Mr. Blunt, is he not? A very conscientious man. He once gave an excellent talk on cough syrups at the Women's Institute." Craddock gave her a look that might have been amusement if he were not so harassed. Well, he's conscientious, but people can be careless even so. And in a matter of poison, carelessness can be fatal." The chemist's shop stood on Marleycombe High Street, a narrow-fronted place with polished windows that displayed tooth powders, cold remedies, and a neat pyramid of lavender soaps. Inside, the familiar scent of antiseptic mingled with the sharper tang of spirits of ammonia. Mr. Blunt himself was behind the counter, a spare, precise man in his 50s, his spectacles gleaming and his hair parted with mathematical accuracy. He looked nervous when the inspector entered with Miss Marple at his side. "Good morning, Inspector," he said briskly, though his hands worried at a ledger. "And Miss Marple. A pleasure as always. How may I assist?" Craddock wasted little time. "Mr. Blunt, it's about arsenic. You sell it, don't you?" The chemist stiffened. "In very small quantities, yes. And only to those with a legitimate need. Gardeners, poultry keepers. There are strict regulations, Inspector. I should not like it thought that I—" "No one's accusing you," Craddock interrupted. "But I've reason to believe that Mr. Pritchard may have had some in his possession. I need to know if he, or anyone connected with him, bought arsenic here in recent weeks." Mr. Blunt hesitated. His eyes slid to Miss Marple, as though her calm presence steadied him. "I keep a poison book, of course," he said finally. "Every purchase entered, every signature recorded. If you'll permit," he pulled a heavy volume onto the counter, its pages covered in neat handwriting. Craddock leaned over, scanning quickly. 2 ounces of arsenical weed killer, purchased a fortnight ago, by Mr. Edward Pritchard. Signed in full." He straightened. So he did have it. Mr. Blunt cleared his throat. "Yes, Inspector. Though he mentioned at the time that it was for his roses. They were much afflicted with greenfly." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Dear me, yes. Though I have always found that soapy water does just as well, and without the danger." Craddock ignored her, rifling through the pages. "Anyone else lately?" The chemist shifted uneasily. "Yes. There was another purchase. Only yesterday, in fact. Miss Edith Lawson, Lady Hartwell's companion. She requested a small bottle of arsenical tonic, ostensibly for her ladyship's geraniums." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Miss Lawson? How curious." Craddock's jaw set. "Curious indeed. And I'll be wanting to know why she didn't mention it when I questioned her." They left the shop together, Craddock muttering darkly about evasions and false statements. Miss Marple, however, walked at her usual unhurried pace, her eyes thoughtful. "Inspector," she said mildly, "do remember that young women in positions such as Miss Lawson's are often, how shall I put it, under pressure. They run errands at the bidding of others. If Lady Hartwell desired the tonic, it would not surprise me that Miss Lawson was the one to fetch it." Craddock frowned. "And if it were Lady Hartwell, what then? She's not short of enemies, but I can't quite see her as a poisoner." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Poisoners rarely look the part, Inspector. They are seldom villains in the theatrical sense. More often, they are merely practical. They paused at the corner of the High Street. Across the way, Lady Hartwell herself was sweeping grandly into the butcher's, her ostrich feather hat bobbing. Miss Lawson trailed behind, pale and anxious, clutching a basket. Craddock narrowed his eyes. Perhaps I should speak to her again, without Lady Hartwell at her elbow this time. I think that would be wise, said Miss Marple. And if you will permit an old woman's suggestion, do ask her not only what she did, but what she overheard. Companions are like wallpaper, often unnoticed but always present. That afternoon, Craddock called Miss Lawson to the police station. She came fluttering in, hands twisting a damp handkerchief, eyes darting like a frightened bird's. Now then, Miss Lawson, Craddock said not unkindly, we've had word from Mr. Blunt that you purchased arsenical tonic yesterday. Why didn't you mention it? I didn't think it mattered, she stammered. It was only for the geraniums. Her ladyship insisted. She said they were looking dreadful, and she would not have Marleycombe think her garden neglected. Her thin shoulders shook. Oh, Inspector, I didn't mean anything wrong. I only do as I am told. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, said gently, Of course you do, my dear. No one thinks otherwise. But perhaps you might tell us, when you were at the chemist's, did you see or hear anything unusual? Miss Lawson hesitated. Then, in a rush, she whispered, I saw Mrs. Pritchard. She was there, speaking to Mr. Blunt. Not about arsenic. No, she was asking about something else. Some kind of sleeping draught. But when she saw me, she went quite red and hurried away. Craddock's brows shot up. Sleeping draught, eh? And she didn't mention that either. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Very interesting, my dear. Very interesting indeed. When Miss Lawson had been dismissed, fluttering but visibly relieved, Craddock turned to Miss Marple with an exasperated sigh. I tell you, it's a web. Arsenic here, sleeping draught there. Everyone buying one thing or another. How am I supposed to sort the truth from the gossip? Miss Marple looked at him with her mild bird-like gaze. By remembering, Inspector, that people rarely change their habits. Arsenic for roses, tonic for geraniums, sleeping draughts for nerves, it all sounds innocent enough. But if one considers who asked, when they asked, and why they chose that moment. She let the words trail off suggestively. Craddock rubbed his temples. And you already have a theory, don't you? Miss Marple smiled serenely. Oh no, Inspector. I only observe. But I dare say that if we watch closely, the truth will soon declare itself. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap. The events of the day ran through her mind in careful sequence. Mr. Pritchard's purchase, Miss Lawson's errand, Mrs. Pritchard's request for a draught. And above them all, like the faint scent of violets, the memory of those mysterious letters lingered. The chemist's secret had opened more questions than it answered. But Miss Marple was content. For in her long experience, the truth had a way of surfacing, like ink seeping through paper, once one paid attention to the smallest stains. Chapter 7. The violet letters resurface. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage. Young Timothy, the errand boy from the post office. His boots were muddy, his cap askew, and in his grubby hand he held an envelope. Begging your pardon, miss, he said, shifting from one foot to the other, but Mr. Barnes at the post asked me to bring this straight to you. Said you might know what to make of it. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. The envelope was cream, of good quality, but what struck her at once was the handwriting. Neat, flowing, unmistakably written in violet ink. Her lips pursed. Indeed, she murmured. How very singular. Inside was a short note. Justice must be done. The guilty will be revealed, and soon. Beware the smiling friend who hides a dagger in her heart. There was no signature. Miss Marple read it twice, then tucked it carefully back into its cover. Thank you, Timothy. You've done very well. She gave him a penny for his trouble, and when he had gone, she sat quite still, her knitting untouched. The violet ink again. And the tone. Half warning, half threat. Someone in Marleycombe was playing a dangerous game. Inspector Craddock was less pleased when she showed him the note later that morning. "Another blasted letter," he exclaimed, thumping his fist against the desk. "As if I didn't have trouble enough. First Pritchard poisoned, now anonymous scribblers. What next?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Letters of this kind are rarely without purpose, Inspector. They may be intended to frighten, or to mislead, or to cast suspicion where it does not belong. But I have often found that the choice of words can be as revealing as a fingerprint." Craddock scowled. "All I see is a veiled threat and more work for me. Smiling friend with a dagger. Indeed. It could mean anyone." Miss Marple's needles clicked quietly. "Not anyone, Inspector. Consider who is both a friend and an enemy in such a place as Marleycombe. Appearances, as we both know, can be deceiving." That afternoon, gossip was thick in the village. At the grocer's, Mrs. Pritchard was heard declaring that she had never in her life received such cruel stares from her neighbors. At the butcher's, Lady Hartwell proclaimed in ringing tones that anonymous letters were the very devil's work, and had once ruined a cousin of hers in Kent. Miss Lawson, pale and fretful, hovered behind her mistress, clutching the parcels. She looked as though she might faint if one more word were spoken. It was Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's wife, who confided to Miss Marple as they lingered near the greengrocer's stall. "My dear Jane, I don't mind telling you I'm uneasy. There are whispers that these letters come from someone inside the Pritchard household. And when people whisper, they often turn quite nasty." Miss Marple patted her arm. "Yes, dear. Whispers are like smoke. They drift everywhere, but smoke always has a fire beneath." That evening, as dusk settled over Marleycombe, a second letter appeared, this time pushed under the door of the village hall, where the Women's Institute was due to meet. It was found by Mrs. Bantry, who shrieked so loudly that half the village heard. Inspector Craddock was summoned at once. Again violet ink. Again no signature. A soul has already been taken. Another will follow unless truth is spoken. Look to the House of Roses, for there the serpent lies coiled. Craddock crumpled the paper in disgust. The House of Roses? That'll set every fool in Marleycombe to pointing fingers at Mrs. Pritchard. Her rose garden is famous enough. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were thoughtful. "And yet, Inspector, serpents do not always lie in the gardens we expect. Sometimes the most dangerous ones are the least conspicuous." The next day, Miss Marple made a quiet call at the vicarage. The vicar's wife poured tea, but Miss Marple's interest lay in the vicar himself. He had a tidy collection of parish records, letters, and ledgers, which he showed her with mild pride. Among them, Miss Marple noticed an old blotter, its pages marked with faint stains of violet ink. She touched the corner with a delicate finger. "How very pretty. Did you once write in violet, Reverend?" The vicar chuckled. "Oh no, Miss Marple. That was from Miss Lawson. She sometimes assists with the parish correspondence. Very particular about her pens. She always insists on violet ink." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered behind her spectacles. "Does she, indeed? How very enlightening." That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting lying idle on her lap. 2 anonymous letters, both written in violet ink. And now she knew at least who in the village habitually used such ink. But did that mean Miss Lawson was the author? Or was someone clever enough to imitate her hand, knowing it might be noticed? Miss Marple smiled to herself, the faint, knowing smile of a woman who had seen many little dramas play out in villages just like Marleycombe. "People will always give themselves away," she murmured, "if only one is patient enough to listen." The violet letters had resurfaced, and with them, the threads of a mystery that was tightening, coil by coil, around the quiet heart of the village. Chapter 8, Whispers at Rose Cottage. Rose Cottage, as everyone in Marleycombe knew, was the pride of Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard. Even in her widow's weeds, she maintained her beloved garden with a diligence that bordered on obsession. The front path was framed by climbing roses, pale pink and crimson, that spilled over in fragrant cascades. Behind their beauty, however, the little house seemed subdued, as though the shadow of her husband's death had dimmed its windows. Miss Marple, wrapped in her grey shawl, Arrived that afternoon under the pretext of bringing a jar of her homemade quince jelly. Few invitations could be refused when offered in such a kindly, grandmotherly way. Mrs. Pritchard opened the door herself. Her face was pale, lined with sleepless worry, but her lips curled in a gracious if strained smile. "Miss Marple, how good of you. Do come in. You find me quite at 6s and 7s. People have been staring and whispering so dreadfully. I sometimes think Marleycombe is a village of gossips and harpies." Now, Miss Marple soothed, stepping inside. "People will chatter. It is their way of expressing fear. Better to chatter than to let fear gnaw silently. Don't you think?" Mrs. Pritchard sighed, leading her into a sitting room that smelled faintly of lavender polish. The furniture was well kept, but the air was heavy, as though laughter had long since fled the walls. On the mantel stood a portrait of Mr. Pritchard, his stern face frozen in oils. Miss Lawson appeared almost at once, carrying a tray of tea and scones. Her hands trembled as she set it down. Miss Marple's sharp eyes did not miss the faint smudge of violet ink on the girl's cuff. "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple said kindly, as though she had noticed nothing. "You must be quite overworked, what with so much excitement in the village." Miss Lawson gave a nervous laugh. "It has been dreadful, Miss Marple. People talk of nothing but the letters. Some even hint. Well, you can imagine what they hint." Mrs. Pritchard's mouth tightened. "Indeed, they do. As though I would have the time or the inclination to write anonymous notes. And in violet ink, no less. Everyone knows Miss Lawson prefers it for her church correspondence. I fear the whole business is designed to cast suspicion upon this household." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "It is often the case, Mrs. Pritchard, that mischief-makers use what is most obvious. A certain ink, a familiar phrase, it is all part of the game. But tell me, did Mr. Pritchard ever receive letters of that kind? Anonymous or otherwise?" At this, a curious silence fell. Miss Lawson glanced at her mistress, then looked away. Mrs. Pritchard hesitated before answering. "My husband did receive 1 or 2 unpleasant notes some months ago. Trivial nonsense about his dealings with the farmers, accusing him of sharp practice. He laughed them off, naturally. I destroyed them." "How wise," Miss Marple murmured, though her eyes were thoughtful. "And yet, it is sometimes in the trivial that one finds the truth." The conversation turned to safer subjects. Gardens, the vicar's sermon, the rising price of sugar, but beneath the polite exchange ran an undercurrent of unease. Miss Lawson scarcely spoke, save to murmur agreement, and her eyes flickered often to the mantel, as though fearing Mr. Pritchard's painted gaze. When tea was over, Miss Marple asked if she might step into the garden. Mrs. Pritchard, eager to display her roses, obliged at once. The garden was, indeed, splendid. Bushes heavy with bloom, paths neatly swept, a little arbor draped in climbing crimson. Birds sang in the hedges, but to Miss Marple the place felt strangely airless, too carefully tended, as though beauty itself had been marshaled into discipline. As they walked, Miss Marple bent once or twice, ostensibly to admire a blossom. On one such occasion, near the back gate, she noticed something odd, a scrap of paper caught among the thorns. She drew it free discreetly, slipping it into her reticule before Mrs. Pritchard could notice. Later, back at her own cottage, Miss Marple examined the fragment under good lamplight. It was torn from the corner of a sheet, the edges jagged, but on it remained a few words written in that same neat violet ink. Truth must be told. Her brows lifted. The letters, then, had not all been carefully delivered to the post or slipped beneath doors. At least one had been written or discarded here at Rose Cottage. Yet Miss Marple was not so hasty as to conclude that it was Miss Lawson's doing. The obvious suspect, in her long experience, was seldom the true culprit. People often borrowed pens, or made use of another's inkpot. And besides, there was something in Miss Lawson's timid manner that suggested fear, not malice. That evening, as dusk fell, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the vicarage. The vicar's wife, bustling and eager to entertain, could not resist sharing the latest morsel of gossip. "They say," she confided, lowering her voice though half the village could have heard, "that Mrs. Pritchard has been seen quarreling with her maid. Poor creature, She was in tears outside the post office yesterday. Quite hysterical, they say. Some declare she means to leave Rose Cottage altogether." Miss Marple sipped her weak tea, her mind turning. Why should a maid be driven to tears at such a time? Was it conscience? Fear? Or had she been threatened into silence? As the women chattered around her, Miss Marple knitted steadily, her thoughts weaving patterns as intricate as her needles. The whispering at Rose Cottage was more than idle gossip. Beneath its roses, something poisonous lingered, something that would not remain hidden for long. Chapter 9. The Maid's Confession. The following morning broke misty and cool, the kind of September day when the village lanes lay hushed beneath a pale veil of fog. Miss Marple, rising early as always, took her customary turn about her garden before breakfast. She deadhead to Rose here, straightened a border there, but her mind was not on her flowers. It was on the fragment of violet-inked paper tucked safely inside her workbasket. The words, "Truth must be told," lingered in her mind like a half-heard echo. Someone at Rose Cottage had meant to tell a truth. But whose truth? And why must it be delivered in secrecy? At 10:30, a timid knock sounded at her cottage door. Opening it, Miss Marple found herself face to face with Mary, the Pritchard's maid. Her eyes were red, her hands wrung tightly in her apron. "Please, Miss Marple," the girl stammered. "Might I have a word? I didn't know where else to go." Miss Marple ushered her in at once, settling her in the little parlor with a cup of tea. "There, my dear. Take your time. No harm ever came from speaking plainly." Mary sniffed, clutching the cup as though for warmth. "It's about the letters, ma'am. Those dreadful letters in violet ink. I never wrote them, not a word, but people think I might have. The mistress says little, but I can feel it in the way she looks at me. And Miss Lawson, well, she won't even meet my eyes." Miss Marple watched her with kind but penetrating attention. "Do you know who did write them, child?" Mary hesitated. I daren't say. It isn't my place. And if I were wrong." "But if you were right," Miss Marple finished gently, "you might help bring peace to this household and to your own conscience." The maid's hands trembled. At last she leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "I think it was Miss Lawson. I've seen her, more than once, scribbling late at night in the little writing desk by the window. And always with that queer violet ink she uses. One night, I heard her tear up a sheet in anger and throw the pieces into the fire. I oughtn't to have noticed, but I was polishing the grate next morning and a bit of paper was left unburned. It said, 'Justice will come.' I didn't understand it then." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. "Did you keep that bit of paper?" Mary shook her head miserably. "No, ma'am. I swept it away. I never thought it would matter. But now with poor Mr. Pritchard gone and the police asking questions." She broke off, wringing her hands. "You have done right to tell me," Miss Marple assured her. "But be careful, Mary. It is not always the one who holds the pen who commands the words. Sometimes another hand guides the thought unseen." The girl looked puzzled, but Miss Marple only patted her hand and sent her off with a small basket of scones for comfort. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a deliberate stroll through the High Street, where she knew gossip flowed as freely as the ale at the King's Arms. Sure enough, she overheard two women talking outside the greengrocer's. "They say the maid means to leave," one said. "Packed her things, she has. Can't bear the whispering." "And no wonder," the other replied. "If she knows who wrote those letters, she won't be safe at Rose Cottage much longer." Miss Marple paused to examine a display of apples, her mind whirring. Fear, then, was driving Mary into flight. Fear of Miss Lawson, or of something far larger. That evening, Miss Marple was invited to the vicarage for supper. The vicar, a mild man fond of long sermons, was quick to voice his own opinion. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, carving the mutton, "there is wickedness in these letters. Wickedness and cowardice. Whoever wrote them sought to poison the very heart of our village with suspicion. If we do not discover the culprit soon, Marleycombe will never be the same." Miss Marple sipped her soup, her eyes thoughtful. "Yes, indeed. Poison seldom remains in the cup, It seeps into the air about us. But sometimes Vicar, the poisoner, leaves a trace, if one knows where to look. Later that night, in the privacy of her cottage, Miss Marple compared the fragment of paper she had found in Mrs. Pritchard's garden with the description Mary had given. The hand was neat, precise, with a curious slant. It could well be Miss Lawson's. And yet, Miss Marple frowned. Why would a timid companion, dependent on her mistress's good will, risk exposure with such bold accusations? Unless she was driven by a force stronger than fear. Love, perhaps. Or hatred. The two, Miss Marple knew, were closer companions than most cared to admit. She folded the fragment carefully away. The maid's confession was valuable, yes, but confessions were not always the whole truth. More often, they were the key to opening a deeper door. Miss Marple resolved that her next step must be to hear Miss Lawson's story, from Miss Lawson herself. Chapter 10, Miss Lawson Speaks. The following afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call at Rose Cottage under the pretext of returning a recipe book she had once lent Mrs. Pritchard. The cottage seemed unusually subdued. The curtains were half drawn though the day was bright, and the air within held that peculiar hush that lingers after death. Mrs. Pritchard herself received Miss Marple in the drawing-room, looking pale and drawn. "I hardly know how to go on, Miss Marple," she said weakly. "First the dreadful letters, and now this unspeakable tragedy. My poor husband, whatever his faults, did not deserve such an end." Miss Marple murmured her condolences, and after a few minutes' polite conversation, she asked gently whether Miss Lawson might be at home. Mrs. Pritchard sighed. "Yes, poor thing. She has taken it all very badly. She is in her room, but I dare say she will see you. You have a way of calming people, Miss Marple." Miss Lawson appeared a few minutes later, her hands fluttering nervously at her skirts. She was a small, dowdy woman of indeterminate age, with a face that seemed perpetually on the verge of apology. "Miss Marple," she said in her thin voice, "how kind of you to call. I am afraid I have not been myself these past days. It has all been so dreadful." Miss Marple, seated comfortably with her knitting on her lap, looked at her with kind but shrewd eyes. "Yes, dreadful indeed. And yet, my dear, sometimes such dreadful events oblige us to be braver than we ever thought possible." Miss Lawson blinked at her, puzzled. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "there are whispers that you may have had something to do with those letters. Written, curiously enough, in violet ink. You are fond of violet ink, are you not?" Miss Lawson flushed scarlet. I do prefer it. I always have. But I did not write those letters. I swear it. Oh, people are so cruel to suggest such a thing." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Mary, the maid, has seen you writing late at night, and she recalls a fragment of paper with the words, 'Justice will come.'" "How do you explain that, my dear?" Tears welled in Miss Lawson's eyes. She clasped her hands tightly. "Very well. I will tell you the truth, though I beg you will not think too harshly of me. Yes, I did write certain pages, in violet ink, when I was upset. I have kept journals all my life. It is the only way I can bear my circumstances." She gave a little gasp. "But I never sent any letters. Never. I burned the pages when they grew too bitter. I thought no one knew." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Then you did not accuse Mrs. Pritchard in writing?" "No," cried Miss Lawson. "Heaven help me, I could not. Mrs. Pritchard has been my only friend. Do you think I would betray her? If I had written those dreadful things, I could never face her again. And yet, I fear she herself suspects me." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, watching the woman twist her handkerchief into knots. Then she asked quietly, "Tell me, Miss Lawson, what did you mean by 'justice will come'?" Miss Lawson's eyes flickered. For a moment, her lips trembled as though she might speak. Then she looked away. "It was nothing, Miss Marple. Merely a foolish phrase. Please believe me. I am not wicked. I am weak, perhaps, but not wicked." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her mind remained alert. "We are none of us perfect, my dear. Weakness can sometimes be more dangerous than wickedness, for it bends too easily to another's will. But I shall believe you for now." At that moment Mrs. Pritchard entered, her face tight with suppressed emotion. "What is this, Lawson? Confessing your scribblings to Miss Marple? I knew it. You have always been jealous of me, always seeking to make yourself the martyr. Well, I shall not tolerate it. When this business is over, I think it best we part ways." Miss Lawson turned as white as the antimacassar on the armchair. But where should I go? I have no one else." Mrs. Pritchard's voice hardened. "That is not my concern." Miss Marple rose swiftly, interposing herself with gentle firmness. Now, Mrs. Pritchard. This is not the moment for reproaches. Your household has suffered enough. What you need is unity, not division." Mrs. Pritchard pressed her lips together, then sat heavily in a chair. "Perhaps you are right, Miss Marple. But the strain is almost unbearable." Miss Marple took her leave shortly after, but as she walked back through the village, her thoughts were troubled. Miss Lawson had denied sending the letters, yet her private writings echoed their venom. Could another hand have taken her discarded pages and transformed them into instruments of malice? She recalled Mary's words. "It isn't my place. And if I were wrong—" The girl knew more than she had confessed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The truth was drawing nearer, but like mist on the downs, it shifted and concealed itself just when one thought it clear. One thing, however, she was certain of: Miss Lawson, though pitiable, was no murderess. Someone else had turned bitterness into poison, and that someone still walked free in Marleycombe. Chapter 11. A Visit to the Vicarage. The vicarage garden was looking particularly neat that September afternoon, its borders trimmed and dahlias standing tall in rows of orderly color. Miss Marple, walking up the path with her basket on her arm, reflected, as she often did, that a well-kept garden usually meant a well-kept mind. Mrs. Dane, the vicar's wife, greeted her warmly at the door. "My dear Miss Marple, how good of you to come. We were just about to have tea in the garden. Come along, there's seed cake fresh from the oven." The vicarage drawing-room was pleasant, but it was always in the garden that Mrs. Dane liked to entertain. She was a comfortable, bustling woman with a sharp eye for detail and a natural inclination toward friendly chatter. The vicar himself was already seated with a book, though he rose politely at Miss Marple's approach. "Now do tell me," Mrs. Dane began as soon as they were settled. "What do you make of it all? Poor Mr. Pritchard. I never liked the man, you know, though of course one mustn't speak ill of the dead. But he was a difficult husband, everyone knew it. Still, poison. One reads of such things in novels, but to have it happen in Marleycombe, it quite oversets me." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "It is certainly distressing, my dear. But you know how it is in villages. Things seldom occur without reason, however strange the reason may appear." Mrs. Dane nodded sagely. "Quite so. Now, between ourselves, I have heard, though I cannot vouch for the accuracy, that Mr. Pritchard was seen quarreling with Mr. Elwood at the post office only a fortnight ago. Something about land rights, I believe. It grew quite heated." "Indeed," said Miss Marple mildly, though her eyes brightened behind her spectacles. "Yes. And then, of course, there is Mrs. Pritchard's companion. Poor Miss Lawson. People have been unkind about her. They say she is bitter, and that she has written unwise things in violet ink. But I cannot believe she would go so far as murder. More likely she has been made a scapegoat." The vicar put down his book with a sigh. "It is wrong to spread idle talk, my dear. But unfortunately, gossip is the very lifeblood of a village. I sometimes think my parishioners would perish of silence if they had no one to discuss." Mrs. Dane laughed. "Well, it is better than silence, perhaps. But mark my words, Miss Marple, there is more beneath the surface. I have noticed Mary, the maid at Rose Cottage, looking most uneasy of late. She avoids my eye, which she never used to do. A guilty conscience, perhaps." Miss Marple asked gently, "Mary has family in the village, does she not?" "Oh yes," Mrs. Dane said. "Her brother works at the chemist's. A respectable lad, though rather quiet. And their mother, Mrs. Harris, is a washerwoman. Poor as church mice, but proud. I dare say Mary has felt the strain of all this unpleasantness. Still, I cannot help thinking she knows more than she lets on. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. And what of Mrs. Pritchard herself? Has she been much seen? Not at all, Mrs. Dane said firmly. She has kept to her house since the funeral arrangements began. People are beginning to whisper that she hides herself because she is guilty. But I say, nonsense. She may be high-strung, but she adored her husband in her way. No, Miss Marple, I would wager a shilling that the truth lies elsewhere. The vicar cleared his throat. We must not forget, however, that arsenic is not easily come by. Someone procured it, and someone administered it. Until that question is answered, all else is speculation. Miss Marple rose a little while later, taking her leave with the usual pleasantries. But as she walked back toward the high street, her mind worked busily. Mary's connection to the chemist was an interesting thread. Access to poisons could often be traced not by those who required them openly, farmers and gardeners, but through a subtler channel. And if Mary had indeed seen or heard something, her silence might spring from fear, not guilt. As Miss Marple turned the corner by the post office, she almost collided with Mr. Elwood himself. He doffed his hat stiffly. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Terrible business, terrible. One doesn't like to see such scandal in a quiet place like this." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Indeed not. I understand you and Mr. Pritchard had words not long ago." Mr. Elwood looked startled, then scowled. "Oh, someone's been talking. Yes, we had a disagreement, but it was a trifling matter. Nothing worth mentioning." He hesitated, then added sharply, "I hope no one imagines I had anything to do with his death. Good day to you, madam." He strode off, leaving Miss Marple watching his retreating back with thoughtful eyes. People were so often most suspicious when they denied things unasked. When she reached her own cottage, she sat down by the fire, her mind collating small scraps of information. The quarrel at the post office, Mary's unease, Miss Lawson's violet ink, and the whispered bitterness in the village. Somewhere among these fragments lay the truth, like a pattern half-stitched. One only had to be patient, and the threads would reveal their design. And Miss Marple had always been patient. Chapter 12. The Maid's Secret. Mary Harris was polishing the brass handles of the Rose Cottage front door when Miss Marple appeared at the gate, her knitting bag tucked neatly under her arm. Mary started visibly, then bobbed a curtsy. "Good afternoon, Mary. How smart the brass looks today. Your mother must be proud of such a diligent daughter." Mary flushed, looking both pleased and uneasy. "Afternoon, ma'am. Mrs. Pritchard likes things shining, though she hasn't said much lately." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "It must have been very hard for you, all this unpleasantness. People talk so unkindly sometimes." Mary's lips trembled. "They do, ma'am. They say things about Miss Lawson, about Madam, even about me. But I swear I never touched nothing." "I am sure you did not, child. But sometimes when one knows a little more than others, it can weigh heavily on one's mind." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost motherly. "If you would like to unburden yourself, you may find it a relief." Mary glanced about nervously. The windows of Rose Cottage were closed, but her eyes darted toward them as though they might conceal listeners. "Not here, ma'am. Could we walk a bit?" "Of course." They strolled slowly toward the lane that led to the churchyard, where the yews stood heavy and solemn. Mary kept her eyes down, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. "It was the night before he died, ma'am," she whispered at last. "I was carrying up the hot water, and I heard voices in the study. Mr. Pritchard and Miss Lawson. They was arguing." Miss Marple nodded, as though this were no surprise. "And what was said?" Mary's voice dropped still lower. "He was angry about a letter. Said she was a fool to write it, and that it would ruin everything if it was found. She said he drove her to it, that she couldn't bear the way things were no longer. Then she began to cry, and he told her she'd best pray the letter never came to light." "Did you see the letter?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Mary shook her head. "No, ma'am. But the next morning, when I dusted the study, there was an envelope on the desk. Violet ink it was, and the writing all slanty. I thought it was just one of Miss Lawson's silly scribbles. But that same night, Mr. Pritchard took poorly. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap of thought. And what became of the letter, Mary? Mary hesitated. That's the thing, ma'am. When I went to clear the room again, it was gone. Vanished clean. I thought perhaps Miss Lawson had taken it back. But what if someone else did? Miss Marple laid a hand lightly on the girl's arm. You did well to tell me. And remember, secrets are often more dangerous than truth. Keep calm, and say nothing to the others. I shall think carefully about what you have said. Mary's relief was palpable. Thank you, ma'am. I've been so afeard. I don't want no trouble for Madam, nor for Miss Lawson neither. But it's been on my conscience. They parted at the lich gate, Mary hurrying back to her duties while Miss Marple lingered among the gravestones. Her mind was turning over the fragments, an incriminating letter in violet ink, a quarrel overheard, a disappearance of evidence. That evening, as the sun sank over St. Mary's spire, Miss Marple wrote a note of her own, in her neat, upright hand. The letter is the key. Find the letter, and the hand that wrote it shall be revealed. She tucked the note into her pattern book, satisfied that she was on the right trail. For Miss Marple knew, from long experience, that letters have a way of surfacing at the most inconvenient times, especially letters written in violet ink. Chapter 13. The Missing Letter. The following morning found Miss Marple seated in her sunny front room, her knitting needles moving briskly while her thoughts drifted far from the neat ball of wool. The violet ink letter occupied her mind like a specter. A letter that threatened exposure, vanished at the very moment its contents might have mattered most. Such things, in Miss Marple's long experience, were seldom coincidental. She rose and adjusted her shawl. The day called for a few well-chosen visits. At the post office, Miss Marple found young Elsie Durrant behind the counter, busy with stamps and parcels. The girl, like many in St. Anselm's, was eager for talk. Good morning, Elsie. I wonder, did you notice any letters of unusual appearance come through last week? Perhaps written in violet ink. Elsie pursed her lips, thinking hard. Why, yes, Miss Marple. There was one, came in on Thursday morning. I remember because I thought it queer. Hardly ever see violet ink. Addressed to Mr. Pritchard it was. Came from the London post, though I couldn't make out the name. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Thank you, my dear. One remembers such little oddities. Does one not? Her next call was to Mr. Smethurst, the village solicitor, who greeted her with the mild surprise of a man unaccustomed to elderly ladies dropping by unannounced. My dear Miss Marple, what brings you? I wanted to ask, in confidence, whether Mr. Pritchard ever spoke to you of difficulties at home? Mr. Smethurst adjusted his spectacles. Difficulties? Oh, there were small domestic frictions, as in any household. But I did once hear him mention that he feared a certain document might cause trouble. He would not elaborate, but he seemed rather agitated. A document? Or perhaps a letter? The solicitor's brows drew together. Now you mention it, he did say letter. Yes. But he brushed it aside, assuring me it was handled. Miss Marple gave a small sigh. Things are so seldom handled as easily as men believe. Later, Miss Marple paused in at the Rosehill tea rooms, where gossip flowed freer than the Darjeeling. At a corner table, Mrs. Price, a plump matron with a fondness for scandal, leaned in confidentially. Mark my words, Miss Marple, that companion of Mrs. Pritchard's, Miss Lawson, is at the heart of it. She was always scribbling notes, running to the post. If there was a letter, it was hers. You'll see. Miss Marple merely nodded, sipping her tea. Village tongues were quick to assign blame, but seldom wise in their accuracy. That evening, as twilight gathered over the village, Miss Marple sat once more in her neat parlor, knitting laid aside. Her thoughts had arranged themselves into order. There was no doubt now. The violet ink letter had come from London, sent to Mr. Pritchard, not written by Miss Lawson as Mary had believed. Yet Mary had seen such a letter on his desk, and afterward it vanished. Why would Mr. Pritchard hide it? Or did another hand remove it? Someone afraid of its contents? Miss Marple recalled Elsie's words. The address was to Mr. Pritchard. If the letter bore accusations, threats, or revelations, then whoever intercepted it must have had strong reason. A faint rustle at her window caught her ear. She rose, lifted the latch, and found a small envelope slipped under the sill. No address. No seal. Only the faint aroma of violets. Inside was a single scrap of paper. The writing hurried, slanting, unmistakably violet. He knew too much. Beware the truth, it will not stay buried. Miss Marple read the words twice, then folded them carefully. The missing letter had not been destroyed. It was in place still, moving like a shadowy figure across the stage. And someone, somewhere wanted her to know. She set her jaw with quiet determination. In St. Anselm's, secrets were beginning to stir from their graves. Chapter 14. The Stranger in the Village. The morning was brisk and clear when a new figure appeared in St. Anselm's, a figure whose presence stirred immediate whispers. Villages are like still ponds. The slightest pebble sends ripples wide. This pebble came in the form of a man in a dark coat, carrying a worn leather satchel, and bearing the look of someone more accustomed to the city's noise than the quiet of country lanes. Miss Marple, walking back from the churchyard with her basket of flowers, was among the first to notice him. He paused outside the post office, consulted a slip of paper, and inquired of Elsie Durrant with a curt, businesslike air. His voice carried, "Mrs. Pritchard, Rose Cottage. Can you direct me?" Elsie, eager to oblige, pointed him down the lane. Her eyes darted after him as though he were an apparition from some tale of intrigue. Within minutes, the whole village would know that a stranger had asked for the widow at Rose Cottage. By the time Miss Marple returned home, the telephone rang, Mrs. Price breathless with curiosity. "My dear Jane, have you seen him? A dark sort of man, tall, with a London manner. Mark me, there's trouble in him. They say he's gone straight to Rose Cottage." "Indeed," said Miss Marple mildly. "Then we shall soon hear what brings him." But Miss Marple did not rely on hearsay alone. A little observation conducted discreetly could yield far more. She took her knitting to the garden bench, from which vantage she might glimpse Rose Cottage through a gap in the hedge. At Rose Cottage, the stranger knocked firmly, and Mary, the maid, admitted him with wide eyes. Shortly after, Mrs. Pritchard herself appeared at the doorway, startled but not displeased. She ushered him inside swiftly, glancing about as though to ensure no one had witnessed. Miss Marple's needles clicked on. Appearances, she reflected, were telling. The widow's surprise had been tempered with recognition. This man was no chance caller. 2 hours later, as the village hummed with speculation, Miss Marple paid a casual call upon Dr. Haydock, who was often her unwitting accomplice in gathering threads of information. "Doctor," she said, after they had spoken of roses and rheumatism, "do you know anything of this new gentleman staying at the inn?" Dr. Haydock chuckled. "Ah, you've seen him too. Calls himself Mr. Charles Denham. Said he was making inquiries regarding the late Mr. Pritchard's affairs. Gave me the impression of a solicitor or agent of some kind. But there's steel beneath the polish. Not the sort to waste time on country pleasantries." "Indeed. And did he mention who engaged him?" "Not precisely. But from what I gather, it concerns a matter of inheritance, or a document that's gone astray. Confidential, of course." "Of course," said Miss Marple, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. That evening, Denham took supper at the village inn, where the locals eyed him with poorly disguised curiosity. Mrs. Price, seated nearby, caught every word. "I am here," Denham announced coolly to the innkeeper, "on behalf of parties in London. There are matters of property and reputation that must be clarified. I trust the good people of St. Anselm's will be cooperative." The words, repeated with embellishment by Mrs. Price the following morning, spread like wildfire. Property. Reputation. London. Each villager embroidered the tale, until it was firmly believed Denham was investigating a scandal of vast proportions. Miss Marple, meanwhile, pieced together the puzzle with her customary patience. The violet ink letter had come from London. Now here was a London man, inquiring after documents, speaking of inheritance and reputations. Surely the two were linked. On the second evening of Denham's stay, Miss Marple contrived to meet him. She entered the inn parlor with her knitting and settled into a corner chair. Presently Denham arrived, poured himself a whiskey, and noticed her with polite surprise. "Good evening, madam." "Good evening. You are Mr. Denham, I believe? Forgive my curiosity. One hears of new arrivals, you know, in a small place such as this." He smiled faintly. "Quite understandable. Yes, I am Charles Denham. And you are?" "Jane Marple. I live in the village. I find human nature endlessly interesting. People reveal more than they intend if one but listens." Denham regarded her with amusement tinged with caution. "A keen observer, then. I imagine you already know why I am here." "Oh, I never assume," said Miss Marple mildly. "But perhaps you might tell me yourself." Denham hesitated, then leaned closer. "Very well. I represent certain interests in London. A letter was sent to Mr. Pritchard, written, I believe, in violet ink. It concerned delicate information, enough to cause grave embarrassment if revealed. That letter has vanished. My task is to recover it before it falls into the wrong hands." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "How very curious. And may one ask what kind of information the letter contained?" Denham's gaze sharpened. "I fear I cannot disclose details, Mrs. Marple. Suffice it to say it involved a legacy. Someone stood to gain or lose a great deal." "Money, then," Miss Marple murmured. "It so often is." He gave a dry chuckle. "Quite so. And you, madam? Do you happen to know anything of the missing letter?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "One hears things, Mr. Denham. One observes. But it is unwise to speak prematurely. Truth, I have found, prefers to ripen at its own pace." Denham studied her, then inclined his head. "Very well. But let me say this. Whoever possesses that letter is in grave danger. I am not the only one seeking it." Miss Marple folded her knitting with care. How very alarming. But inwardly she thought, yes, danger indeed. For the truth never stays buried, and those who dig for it may unearth more than they intended. Chapter 15. The Alibi of Mary Higgins. The village of St. Anselm's had always considered Mary Higgins a simple sort of girl, plain in face, modest in dress, dutiful in service. She had been with Mrs. Pritchard at Rose Cottage for nearly 5 years, and in that time had proven loyal, if not especially clever. Yet, in times of suspicion, even the most ordinary servant can find herself under a merciless glare. It was Inspector Graves who first pressed the matter. He had returned from a fruitless day of inquiries in Marleycombe, clearly irritated. His manner with Mary was brisk, even sharp. "Now, Miss Higgins," he said, standing square in the little kitchen, "you told us you were out that evening, running an errand for Mrs. Pritchard. Do you still hold to that?" "Yes, sir," Mary replied, twisting her hands in her apron. "I went to the grocer's, sir, for flour and tea. Mrs. Pritchard had guests to expect the next day." "Very convenient," the inspector muttered. "And did anyone see you there?" Mary blinked. I don't rightly know. Mr. Pottle was at the counter, but he was serving another gentleman. I paid young Freddie, the boy. I don't think he was paying me much mind." The inspector narrowed his eyes. "And how long did this errand take you?" "Not long, sir. Half an hour at most." "Then perhaps you can explain why Mrs. Durrant swears she saw you walking past the churchyard nearly an hour later, at a time much closer to the murder." Mary's mouth fell open. "No, sir. That can't be. I was back at the cottage by then. I swear it. Mrs. Pritchard herself saw me." The inspector's look was grim. "We shall see." News of Mary's questionable alibi spread like fire through the hedgerows. By afternoon, the village had divided itself neatly in two: those who believed the maid innocent, poor simple creature, incapable of such a deed, and those who thought her guilt plain. Servants always know more than they ought. Mark my words, it's always the maid. Miss Marple, as ever, declined to take sides. She observed. She listened. And she remembered a dozen little things that others overlooked. That evening she called quietly at Rose Cottage, where Mary sat in the scullery, red-eyed and trembling. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you must not distress yourself. But tell me again, calmly, what happened that night." Mary repeated her story, faltering at points. "I went to the grocer's. I came straight back. Mrs. Pritchard was in the parlor. She saw me come in. Truly she did." "And you are certain you did not pass by the churchyard?" Mary shook her head vehemently. "No, miss. Not I. I wouldn't go near it after dark. It frightens me." Miss Marple regarded her with kind but searching eyes. "Then perhaps Mrs. Durrant saw someone else. Memory can be a very tricky thing. It is so easy to mistake a figure in the dusk. But tell me, when you returned, what was Mrs. Pritchard doing?" Mary hesitated. "Writing, miss. She had her little desk open, the one by the fire. She looked troubled as though she had been crying. She said nothing to me, only waved me away." "Writing," Miss Marple murmured. "With violet ink, perhaps?" Mary blinked. "Yes, miss." "How did you know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind working. The pieces were drawing closer. 2 days later, the inspector summoned Mrs. Pritchard herself. "Madam," he said sternly, "your maid claims you saw her return at 9 o'clock. Yet the time of death has been placed at shortly before 9:30. Can you vouch for her movements?" Mrs. Pritchard's hands trembled. Yes, I saw her. She brought in the parcels. But after that, I cannot be certain. I was distracted." "Distracted how?" She flushed. "A personal matter. A letter I had received. It concerned my late husband. Forgive me, Inspector, but I cannot share more." The inspector's lips thinned. "Then you leave me little choice but to consider both you and your maid under suspicion." That evening, Miss Marple sat alone by her hearth, the fire casting gentle flickers against her thoughtful face. "Mary Higgins," she mused aloud. "A frightened girl, but no killer. Mrs. Pritchard, clearly anxious over her letter. And now Mr. Denham, chasing shadows of inheritance. The letter, always the letter. Everyone circles around it, as though it were the very heart of this mystery." Her needles clicked steadily. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour. And in Miss Marple's quiet mind, a plan began to form, one that would test the truth of Mary Higgins' alibi once and for all. Chapter 16. Secrets at the Vicarage. The vicarage at St. Anselm's had always been a place of comfort and charity. Warm fires, tea at the ready, and Mrs. Mayhew's bustling presence ensuring no visitor left unfed. But now, with the shadow of murder hanging over the village, the vicarage became something else entirely. A refuge for gossip, speculation, and the nervous chatter of neighbors too frightened to speak in their own homes. Miss Marple was welcomed in as naturally as one might welcome a kindly aunt. Mrs. Mayhew fluttered about, pouring tea, fussing over sandwiches, and lamenting the terrible goings-on. The Reverend Mayhew, a thoughtful man with spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose, stood near the hearth trying, and failing, to mask his curiosity about the case. "It is dreadful, simply dreadful," Mrs. Mayhew declared as she pressed a plate of seed cake upon her guest. "To think such wickedness could occur here, in St. Anselm's of all places. And poor Mrs. Pritchard, with that dreadful letter. Why, I should faint dead away if I received such a thing." Miss Marple took a delicate bite of cake. "Letters can be curious things," she remarked mildly. "They often reveal more than one intends, and conceal even more than one realizes." The vicar gave a sharp glance at that. "You have the right of it, Miss Marple. I must confess, though perhaps I ought not, that Mrs. Pritchard did indeed come to see me about the matter of that letter. She was quite shaken. She feared its contents might become public." Mrs. Mayhew's eyes grew round. "Arthur, you promised you would not tell." "I am not revealing its contents, my dear, only acknowledging what you already suspected." He turned to Miss Marple, his expression grave. "The letter bore implications about her late husband, implications of scandal. I need not tell you how gossip spreads in a place like this." She was beside herself at the thought. Miss Marple's needles clicked quietly in her lap. "And yet, Reverend, such a letter could just as easily be a weapon. A weapon of blackmail, perhaps. The vicar pursed his lips. You may not be wrong. She feared as much. But she swore she had never received demands for money, only veiled threats that the truth would out. And the violet ink? Miss Marple asked casually. The Reverend blinked. You know of that? Miss Marple smiled faintly. One learns a great deal if one listens. As they spoke, the vicarage doorbell rang. Freddie Pottle, the grocer's boy, shuffled in with a message for the Reverend. He was a lanky youth, all elbows and freckles, with an air of perpetual guilt, as though he had been caught in mischief even when he had not. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the smudge of violet ink on his fingertips. Delivering more letters, Freddie? She asked kindly. He jumped. Oh, and no, miss. Just a note from Mr. Denham, asking Reverend Mayhew to call upon him tomorrow. The boy shuffled, clearly anxious to be gone. But Miss Marple's gentle persistence drew him out. Freddie, you handle many errands in the village, do you not? Did you, by chance, see Mary Higgins at the grocer's the night of the murder? Freddie scratched his head. Well, yes, miss, I did. She bought flour and tea. I served her myself. But, he hesitated, glancing nervously at the Reverend and his wife. But what, Freddie? Miss Marple prompted softly. He swallowed. She seemed in an awful hurry. Didn't stop to chat like usual. And she dropped a paper, a little folded note. I picked it up and meant to give it her, but she was out the door too quick. I never told no one. Miss Marple's needles stilled. A folded note, you say? Do you still have it? Freddie flushed crimson. Aye, miss. I kept it thinking it might be important. But I didn't dare show the inspector. Thought I'd get in trouble for keeping it. From his pocket, he produced a crumpled slip of paper. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. The writing was scrawled urgent, and in violet ink. The note read, You are watched. Speak to no one. The truth must remain buried, or another will die. Mrs. Mayhew gasped. The vicar crossed himself. Miss Marple, however, merely nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. Thank you, Freddie, she said gently. You have done the right thing now. Go along and say nothing of this to anyone. The boy fled, relieved. Miss Marple folded the note with deliberate care. You see, Reverend, Mrs. Pritchard was not the only one to receive letters in violet ink. Mary Higgins, too, was warned, or threatened. Someone wished to frighten her into silence. And if she had nothing to hide, then why trouble themselves with such warnings? The Reverend frowned. Then you believe Mary is innocent? Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled faintly, though her voice was grave. I believe she knows more than she realizes. And I believe someone fears that knowledge. That night, as Miss Marple walked home beneath the shadow of the church spire, she considered the note's ominous words. The truth must remain buried, or another will die. The letter had been meant to terrify. But to Miss Marple, it revealed something else entirely. The killer was not yet finished. And unless she was very careful, St. Anselm's would see another death before the truth came to light. Chapter 17. The Garden at Dusk. The gardens at Marleycombe House had always been a place of quiet beauty. Winding paths, clipped hedges, and beds of late summer roses still clinging stubbornly to bloom. Yet, in the fading light of dusk, the air seemed heavy, almost watchful, as though the very flowers held their breath. Miss Marple moved slowly along the gravel path, her small figure framed against the shadows. She had insisted on this solitary walk, despite Colonel Denton's offer to accompany her. To her, solitude was a better companion for thinking than the chatter of even the kindest neighbors. The case had grown knotted. Violet ink letters, arsenic whispered secrets about Mrs. Pritchard's late husband, and now Mary Higgins, meek, timid Mary, drawn into it by threats scrawled in the same telltale hand. It is never the obvious thing, Miss Marple told herself. The truth, like roots in a garden, runs beneath the surface. As she rounded a corner of the yew hedge, she saw a figure ahead, stooped, furtive. It was Mary Higgins herself. She carried a lantern and appeared to be searching among the flower beds. Miss Marple approached quietly. "Good evening, Mary." The housemaid jumped, nearly dropping the lantern. "Oh, Miss Marple, you gave me such a fright. I was only," she faltered, her thin hands trembling. "Only what, dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mary lowered her eyes. "Looking for something I lost." But her tone betrayed her. Miss Marple had heard the same quaver in voices long ago, when village girls tried to hide broken trinkets or forbidden letters. "Perhaps I might help," Miss Marple suggested. "I have rather sharp eyes, even at my age." Mary shook her head. "No, no, it's nothing. Truly." Then, after a pause, she whispered, "I dropped another note. The same kind as before. I thought if I found it first, I might keep it safe." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Another letter in violet ink?" Mary nodded miserably. "Slipped from my pocket while I was hanging washing. I couldn't let anyone else find it." Miss Marple held out her hand. "Show me the lantern. We'll look together." For nearly half an hour, the two women combed the damp grass and shrubs. The crickets sang, and the last glow of the sun faded into a wash of indigo. At last, beneath the edge of a rosebush, Miss Marple's hand closed on a crumpled paper. She smoothed it open. The familiar violet script danced across the page. "Silence is safety. Speak and the grave awaits." Mary gave a little sob. "It's horrid. They mean to kill me, don't they?" Miss Marple slipped the note into her reticule. "Not if I can help it, my dear. Letters such as these are written to frighten, to confuse. That is their power. But their writer may not be as clever as they believe." As they turned back toward the house, Miss Marple paused. There was movement in the shadows near the garden wall, a swift dart of fabric, the sound of retreating footsteps. "Did you see?" Mary whispered. "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes narrowing. "And it was not the gait of a stranger. Whoever it was, they belong here." Back inside, Miss Marple excused herself to the drawing room, where Inspector Graves sat with Colonel Denton. She handed the violet note to the inspector. He frowned. "Another. Then this proves Higgins is being threatened. But by whom? The evidence still points to her. She had access to arsenic, and Mrs. Pritchard accused her outright before she died." Miss Marple shook her head. "Inspector, may I remind you that accusations at death are not always truths? Sometimes they are desperate attempts, either to expose or to conceal." Colonel Denton leaned forward. "You have an idea, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly. "Not yet. But I have a suspicion that the garden may hold more secrets than roses. I shall return tomorrow in daylight." That night, as she prepared for bed at her cottage, Miss Marple reviewed all she knew. Letters in violet ink. 2 recipients, Mrs. Pritchard and Mary Higgins. Threats designed not only to frighten but also to silence. And someone lurking in the garden at dusk, close enough to overhear. Yes, she thought, the garden will speak if one knows how to listen. But Miss Marple also knew this. The killer was watching. And time was running short. Chapter 18. The Inspector's Mistake. Inspector Graves prided himself on being a man of action rather than of theory. The morning after Miss Marple's discovery in the garden, he arrived at Rose Cottage with his jaw set and his notebook already half filled with scribbled notes. Mary Higgins, pale from a sleepless night, sat trembling in the kitchen while the inspector questioned her. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in a corner with her knitting, seemed absorbed in her needles. In truth, not a word escaped her. "You expect us to believe," Graves barked, "that these threatening notes were left for you, while you had no hand in the poisoning of Mrs. Pritchard. Convenient, I call it. Very convenient indeed." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "I swear, Inspector, I never touched poison in my life." Graves snapped his notebook shut. "Then how do you explain this arsenic?" He set a small packet on the table, the very substance found in the late Mrs. Pritchard's medicine. "We searched your room this morning." Mary gasped. "But that's not mine." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Inspector," she said gently, "forgive me, but one might ask, how very odd that the poison should be found so openly. Criminals, in my long experience, rarely leave evidence neatly on their own bedside tables. It smacks more of a plant than of guilt. Graves frowned. Plant? What do you mean, ma'am? That someone wished Mary to appear guilty. And if one wished that very much, what easier way than to place the packet where your men would look? The inspector flushed. With respect, Miss Marple, that is speculation. I deal in facts. The fact is arsenic was found in her room. And she had quarrels with the mistress. Motive enough. Mary sobbed. Miss Marple merely smiled faintly and returned to her knitting. Facts can be most misleading, Inspector, unless one knows how to arrange them. That afternoon, Inspector Graves made his move. In the village square of Marleycombe, he declared Mary Higgins formally under arrest for the murder of Mrs. Pritchard. A crowd gathered, villagers whispering, some pitying, some triumphant. Miss Hartnell muttered, "I always said that girl was sly. Mark my words, Miss Marple, she did it." Mr. Hawthorne shook his head. "Poor creature. She hasn't the strength to swat a fly, let alone commit murder." Miss Marple, standing on the edge of the gathering, said nothing. Her eyes, however, were sharp as a hawk's. She noticed one figure slipping away before the inspector's proclamation was finished, a figure who seemed all too eager to avoid the crowd's attention. That evening, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Colonel Denton. "I fear the inspector is too hasty," she told him. Denton sighed. "I've never trusted Graves' instincts. He's a good man, but he jumps at shadows. You think Mary innocent?" "I do," Miss Marple said firmly. "There is something altogether too convenient about the evidence against her. Poison found in her room. A servant accused by her mistress. Threatening notes to deepen suspicion. It is all arranged, too neatly." Denton leaned forward. "Then who, in your opinion, arranged it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "That is the question. But consider this. Who had access to both Mrs. Pritchard's medicine and to Mary's bedroom? Who would gain if Mary were removed, silenced forever by a rope around her neck?" The colonel whistled softly. "You mean the letters were meant not only to terrify but also to divert suspicion?" "Precisely. And if one wished to silence Mary, what better way than to make her appear guilty? No one listens to the condemned." The next day, Miss Marple acted in her own way, quietly, without fanfare. She visited the vicarage, then the village shop, then stopped to speak with the gardener at Marleycombe House. Everywhere she went, she listened. To gossip, to idle remarks, to slips of the tongue that others dismissed. By evening, she had gathered a handful of threads. Mrs. Pritchard had quarreled not only with Mary but with her brother-in-law over money. Violet ink was sold only at one shop in the district, Mr. Blackwell's stationery store, and his records showed a gentleman's purchase, not a servant's. And most curious of all, on the night of Mrs. Pritchard's death, a shadow was seen near the garden wall, tall, not slight like Mary. Miss Marple returned home, satisfied. She sat down by her lamp, knitting set aside, and wrote a neat letter to Inspector Graves. "Dear Inspector, might I beg of you to delay further proceedings against poor Mary Higgins? There are matters yet to be cleared up, and I believe your present course may end in grave error. If you will allow me one day, I think the truth shall be plain." She signed it with her delicate hand and folded it into an envelope. As she sealed it, she murmured, "The inspector's mistake is common enough. He looks for guilt in the most visible place. But murder, like weeds, often grows in the shade." That night, Marleycombe lay under a silver moon. The case seemed settled to most. The servant guilty, justice near. Only Miss Marple sat wakeful in her little sitting room, her mind knitting a pattern far more intricate than wool. The next step, she knew, would bring the truth out into the open, whether the inspector liked it or not. Chapter 19. The Violet Ink Confession. The following morning brought an air of grim finality to Marleycombe. Word spread quickly that Mary Higgins was to be transferred to the county jail for trial. Villagers gathered in knots along the high street, whispering, some condemning, others uneasy. Miss Marple, however, had no intention of letting things rest. With her letter to Inspector Graves still unanswered, she decided upon more direct measures. She arrived at the police station just as Graves was preparing the papers. "Inspector," she said mildly, "might I have a few moments of your time?" There is something you must see before Mary is sent away. Graves groaned. Miss Marple, I've humored your speculations long enough. The evidence. Evidence can be forged, Inspector, she interrupted gently. And in this case, I believe it has been. From her handbag, she produced 2 letters. The threatening violet ink notes. Do you see, Inspector, the flourishes on the capital letters? This style of hand belongs not to Mary Higgins but to someone far more educated. Indeed, I have in my possession a sample written by Mr. Lionel Pritchard, the deceased lady's brother-in-law. It matches in every particular. Graves stared. You accuse him? I do not accuse, Miss Marple said. I only suggest you ask him certain questions. For instance, why he purchased violet ink at Mr. Blackwell's shop only a fortnight ago. Or why a tall figure, resembling his build, was seen near the garden wall on the very night of the murder. Graves, red-faced, nevertheless accompanied Miss Marple to the Pritchard residence. Lionel Pritchard received them with forced joviality, but his hands shook as Miss Marple requested he provide a short sample of handwriting. When the inspector compared it with the violet letters, the resemblance was undeniable. You've tricked me into this, Lionel shouted, paling. I had nothing to do with my sister-in-law's death. Miss Marple's eyes were kind, yet piercing. But you did. You sought her fortune, did you not? And she refused. You thought to remove her, and to make the poor servant girl bear the blame. Such things have happened before, you know. Human greed dresses itself in cunning, but always leaves a thread or 2 hanging loose. Lionel sank into a chair, his defiance crumbling. She was impossible, always lording over us, keeping the purse strings tight. I only meant to frighten her with those letters at first, but when she threatened to cut me out of her will entirely. Graves leaned forward. So you slipped poison into her tonic? Lionel buried his face in his hands. It was so easy. And when I saw Mary had quarreled with her, I knew everyone would suspect the maid. I never thought it would unravel. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Murder always unravels, Mr. Pritchard. Sooner or later. Graves snapped the handcuffs around the man's wrists. The inspector shot Miss Marple a sheepish glance. Seems I nearly made a grave mistake. I'll see that Mary is released at once. Miss Marple inclined her head. I am certain she will be most grateful, Inspector. That evening, the village buzzed with astonishment. The gossip turned swiftly from condemnation of Mary to shock at Lionel's betrayal. The vicar declared from his pulpit that very night, the wages of greed are death, sometimes one's own. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her pew, merely thought, justice has a way of coming round if one is patient enough. Chapter 20. The Quiet Justice of Miss Marple. 2 days later, Marleycombe returned to its routine. The shops opened, the church bell tolled, and yet the village seemed altered. For in every whisper of gossip, there was the acknowledgment that evil had been near, not in the hands of a servant but in the heart of a gentleman. Mary Higgins was released to sympathetic embraces. She came at once to Rose Cottage, her eyes overflowing. Oh, Miss Marple, how can I ever thank you? Miss Marple patted her hand. No thanks are needed, my dear. But do take this as a lesson. Never quarrel too loudly, especially where poison is about. It gives others dangerous opportunities. Mary promised she would. That evening, Colonel Denton joined Miss Marple for tea. He raised his cup with a smile. You've done it again, Miss Marple. Graves admits freely he would have sent the wrong soul to trial without your interference. I dare say the Yard itself will soon be calling you for assistance. Miss Marple shook her head. Oh no, Colonel. I am far too old for excitement. But you see, village life teaches one all there is to know about human wickedness. A quarrel at the Women's Institute, or a dispute over a garden hedge, they are the same motives writ small that drive men to murder. Denton chuckled. And to think all this over violet ink. Ah, Miss Marple said softly. The smallest details are often the most revealing. A shade of ink, a style of handwriting, a careless purchase in a village shop. Those are the threads one must notice. As dusk fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting once more. The summer evening glowed gently over Marleycombe, washing the village in golden light. Children's laughter drifted up the lane, and somewhere a blackbird sang. All seemed peaceful again. Yet Miss Marple, with her quiet eyes, knew well that peace in an English village was never permanent. Secrets lay everywhere, under roses and behind curtains, waiting for the observant eye. She murmured to herself, "Murder is just life with the varnish stripped off. And people, well, people are the same everywhere, whether in Marleycombe or Mayfair." Her needles clicked on. Another case closed, another pattern finished. The midnight letter in violet ink had revealed its secret, and Miss Marple alone had seen it from the start.